Hi, and welcome to week 6 of world history until 1500. This time we're going to look a little bit at Rome, although actually we're going to look at the formation of Republican Rome. It's up to you to read about the empire and beyond, so lots of cool stuff going on. Now, according to legend, Rome was formed by the demigod Romulus, who was one of twins that were born to the god of war, Mars. Mars had impregnated a woman who gave birth to twins out of wedlock. And of course, we have to keep this in context that in the Greco-Roman world, it wasn't unusual for the stories of gods to give birth to mortals, or to sire mortals, rather. That was fairly rampant. So Romulus and Remus are two twins who are left in the woods to die, where they are suckled by a she-wolf who had just given birth to her puppies. Now, why the she-wolf didn't eat the babies and then feed her puppies, I don't know, but there you have it. She was suckled them long enough so that they weren't going to starve to death, and kept them warm until a shepherd found them. They were eventually raised by a shepherd, but even though they were living a humble life, their godlike blood came through, and they were constantly fighting with each other. Eventually, Romulus kills Remus in an argument, and then, fleeing his home, finds some followers, and they go on to found Rome. So what's the point of this myth? Why would you want to have as your backstory the foundation of your civilization be a fratricidal, really twitchy kind of leader? Well, maybe it's because you're living in a very violent world, and maybe the connection to the divine explains why your civilization began. So what does this tell you about early Roman mindset? Well, maybe the early Romans believed that war was the most important aspect of their lives. However, that myth doesn't hold up as the Republic moves on. This older myth is supplanted by the poet Virgil, who recasts Roman mythology in the Aeneid. The Aeneid, published somewhere between 29 and 19 BCE, tells the story of a Trojan prince, Aeneas, who flees the destruction of Troy and founds the new city that he calls Rome, nestled in this beautiful little valley surrounded by 7 hills and very far away from any of the raiders who might attack his ragtag fugitive fleet. Well, that kind of glosses over the fact that, well, the founding of Rome was actually in kind of not very good, scummy area. They were in the middle of a swamp, and they were really kind of poor. So maybe this noble struggle harkens back to a lost glory and a connection to a world that's older than the classical Greek world. So what does this myth tell you about the new Roman mindset by the end of the Republic? Maybe that they are more focused on culture and on auspicious beginnings and of claiming their heritage in the world. Well, the reality is that Rome was settled by nomadic Indo-European tribes right around 1000 BCE, and they adopted the practices of other civilizations around them. When you're a small society, you don't literally reinvent the wheel, you borrow from more successful societies, and that's exactly what the Romans did. Over time, they become dominated by a society called Etruria to the north, and they become a vassal state and pay tribute to the Etruscans. Now, the Etruscans are a rival to Carthage, and both Etruria and Carthage struggle against each other throughout the Archaic and into the classical period in which Rome finds itself. The Carthaginians, of course, are dominating Mediterranean trade and are largely ignoring Rome, both because they are a small player on the stage, I mean a very small player, and also because they're really far inland and don't really have a lot of experience in trading on the oceans. Now, the Greek fighting style that we talked about last time, that hoplite and phalanx formation, was initially adopted by the Romans. However, this formation is really ill-suited for the Italian terrain, a very hilly, forested terrain compared to a relatively flat, open, more scrub-like area in Greece where they often fought. Not that Greece doesn't have nice orchards or nice trees or some really rolling green countryside, but typically the places where the Greeks fought, they were relatively dry, relatively open. And I mentioned the Etruscans just a second ago. The Etruscans lived in this area, the dark brown, called Etruria. Etruria becomes known as the place of the Etruscans. So there you are, much like America's the place of Americans, right? Well, that name gets kind of morphed and mutated over time to become known as Tuscany, one of the more desirable regions in the Italian peninsula. And the Etruscans were an oligarchic theocracy. An oligarchy is rule by an elite bunch, and theocracy is a priestly leading, or a society led by priests. So theo literally means God, and crassy means rule by, although let's be honest, the gods didn't really rule Etruria. It was the people who spoke for the gods, in other words, the priests. Women in general had more power and more authority than in the Hellenic world or in the Roman world either. There's often statuaries and vases and similar works of art that show women bearing their breasts, but it's not for prurient interest, it's not pornographic. It is believed by the Etruscans that breasts, symbolizing life, ward off evil. So bearing one breast or bearing two breasts is being honest, being open, being fruitful, and warding off evil. So women were accorded generally a relatively large amount of freedom, and this offended most Greek sensibilities, particularly Roman sensibilities, which were very aligned with Greek. Now, technically, Rome was a kingdom. Although I should stop and clarify here. Rome was a kingdom insofar as the king was typically elected by the landed elite. The landed elite selected from amongst themselves who would rule Rome's city-state area, the small territory that it controlled. Legend holds that only 7 kings ruled Rome before the plebeian revolt about 509 BCE that changed the government forever and instituted a res publica, which I'll get to in just a moment. Well, that's kind of questionable. Over the course of, say, 300-ish years, you only have 7 kings. Those were either remarkably long-lived kings, or maybe you're fudging the facts. For instance, legend holds that Rome was founded on 7 hills. Well, again, not really. The 7 hills is somewhat of a later construct, much like the Aeneid. So we'll go ahead and leave it there. The reality was that there were multiple revolts that did eventually end the kingship in Rome. First, it was the revolt of the orders, the older, more powerful families, and then eventually the plebeians or their clients who revolted against the equites, the equestrians, the knights, and the stronger families. The last Roman king we do know for a fact was a tyrant who was imposed from Etruria. Now, a tyrant is different from a king, especially in the Roman experience, in that the tyrant, whatever the tyrant says, goes. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were a bad person or that they were a bad leader. They just had absolute power, much like a tyrant in the Greek world. So, this absolute power from Etruria, he was eventually unseated. Now, according to Roman legend, that the Roman commoners revolted to force his replacement in 509 BCE. The reality is, and this is confirmed by archaeological evidence, that Romans were just basically opportunists. Etruria was losing a war against Carthage and other Hellenistic powers at the time, or Hellenic powers actually, at the time, and so was weakening in its ability to control its territory. And so the former vassal rebels, throws off the king, doesn't get noticed, and the Romans wage war against Etruria. Now, the Roman historians believed that the rebellion caused Etruria to fall. The reality is, probably not. If it had just been that rebellion, there'd have been no way that poor Rome would have been able to unseat Etruria by itself. So, the Etrurians are dominating the Italic, or the people who live in the Italian peninsula, Gallic, and Roman neighbors by about 800 BCE. The encroaching Hellenic and Hellenistic, later on by the time we get to the 3rd century, and Carthaginian rivals caused the power to shift, and Rome wages war on its former masters roughly the same time. So we can say that the Etruscans had their moment in the sun and then were eclipsed by the rising Romans, who were very opportunistic. Around 500 BCE, that plebeian revolt brings about the new Roman constitution. Initially, the patriarchs wanted to return to this kingship, but in order to successfully revolt, they had rallied the plebeians to fill the ranks of their army and had made some promises that they really didn't follow through on. The plebeian revolt around that time essentially forced the higher orders to concede to certain agreements, and the establishment of what was known as a res publica, or a republic. Res meaning ownership, and publica meaning public, so the ownership by the people. And as an upshot, you have another early written guarantee of rights, laws, and obligations that are called the 12 Tables, much in the same vein that the Code of Hammurabi was written down in order to make it immutable. So were the 12 Tables. They were essentially a way to safeguard from abuses of power. The representatives who actually ran the government were elected, and they made the laws and governed society in trust with the public. This is different from demoskratia, or democracy. Democracy requires that people who are citizens of the city-state meet and debate pretty much every issue, or they have to sit and become juries on pretty much every case, or they have to go to war, or they have to drop everything they're doing in order to run the society. Res publica kind of does away with that. You can vote, you vote somebody who represents your interests the best, and then you go back to being a blacksmith or a shepherd or a potter or whatever, and trust that they will run the government correctly. If they don't, when they come up for re-election, you vote somebody else in. So why wouldn't democracy work in Rome? Well, it might have at the very beginning when Rome was a city-state, but as it expands, this would become unwieldy. Imagine if we in the United States were a true democracy. We would have to go to Washington, D.C. all the time. We would have to debate. Imagine how big our parliament would be, or conversely, how small the citizenship numbers would be. So here's the Republican form of government. The Senate was prime. The Senate was the body that ruled the government. Now, they had an executive branch called the consuls, and there were 2 of them, and they were merely executing the laws of the land. They weren't more powerful than the Senate. In fact, they were technically subservient to the Senate, although some consuls do have a lot of power. Once you served in the Senate, you were eligible to become a consul. Once you were a consul, you could serve back in the Senate, or you could become what is known as a proconsul, which is a governor. There's all sorts of ways in which you could take power or use that power for your advantage. So sometimes the consuls were very powerful and had a lot of influence over the Senate, but by and large, the position of consul was not superior to the Senate. Now, Romans were very successful. One of the ways that they were successful is they extended the right of citizenship particularly to elite and well-to-do peoples outside of their city-state. And so they're not conquered per se, but more cajoled and brought into the fold and become part of the Roman Republic as if they were equal to Romans. So you can imagine this is kind of attractive, especially as the society gets larger, gets more successful. There's guarantees of rights, there's guarantees of property rights and political rights and power and that sort of thing. It makes more sense to join rather than to resist. Those codified laws, as I mentioned before, do prevent arbitrary rulings and injustice, at least at first. So protection under the law means stability and peace, which is very important when you think about at this time that Etruria is collapsing. Etruria is falling into chaos, and as any society falls into chaos, there's going to be instability and banditry and that sort of thing. There's also checks and balances that were built into the Roman political system. All terms, whether you were senator or a consul, were only 1 year long, and theoretically anybody could rise to lead the society. So you didn't have to be born of the right family, you didn't have to be born in the right city, you didn't have to be born of the certain pedigree. Of course, Rome has a very rough start. It's a small early republic, and even though it has acquired some local allies into its neighbors, there are hostile neighbors as well, particularly the Celts, what are often referred to as Gaelic raiders. They devastate Rome for many years, and in fact, Rome is sacked several times. Partly because Rome is relatively small, but also partly because the phalanx fighting that is so successful in Greece is really not very good for Italy. It requires a lot of logistics and open spaces, and the barbarian Gauls fight in ways that undermine the phalanx tactics. So the future of this Roman Republic is really in danger, and there's a need for reform. Over time, these reforms do take place, and I'm going to fast forward through them instead of stop and saying, and on this year, this happened, and on that year, that happened. So there's a new army for a new society. We have a new sword called the gladius that is borrowed directly from the Celts. It's called the gladius hispaniensis, or the Spanish sword. It is a straight double-edged sword with a triangular point. Don't worry, I'll show you a picture of it in just a minute here. It's a stabbing weapon. Now, why would you want a stabbing weapon as opposed to the falcata, which is the Greek slashing weapon? The Greek falcata has a lot of metal on the very ends of it, almost axe-like. So why would you want a stabbing weapon instead of a slashing weapon? Well, one reason, slashes tend to be relatively shallow. Stabs tend to be relatively deep. Slashes can be deflected by armor or by shields. Stabs find weak points in armor and in shields. Slashes can easily be treated, or the blood can be stanched relatively easily. Stabs, however, can puncture vital organs just below the surface. So stabs are, in general, better to devastate the enemy, but they're also better because they conserve energy. Think about it. Raise your hand over your head and slash down a couple of times. Just keep slashing. Keep going. Do it. I know you're sitting there, you're not doing it. I know you're not doing it. But try it. Raise your hand over your head and slash down. See how much energy is involved in moving just your hand like that? Now stop. If you're doing it, stop, and I know you've already not been doing it, so just go ahead and stop. We'll pretend you stop. Now, with your arm at a 90-degree angle next to your body, move your hand forward and back a couple of times. See how much more efficient that is? So stabbing is way more efficient. Your army tires out a lot less. Plus, it exposes a lot less flesh to the enemy. You're stabbing, you're bringing the weapon forward, and you're guarded by that hand guard. You're less likely to get something hacked off. You also have a new shield called a scudum, a curved rectangular shield, as opposed to the round, flattish shield that the Greeks used. Why would you want to use these? Well, think about shingles on a roof. If you have round shingles on a roof, you're going to have leaks here and there. Whereas if you have squared shingles and they overlap each other, the water is going to roll off more likely. And then, of course, you have the pila, or javelins. Yes, the Greeks had been using javelins, but not in this way. The Romans replaced that metal or bronze tip with a lead tip. The lead tip, you're like, lead? Why would you do that? Well, lead has a tendency to bend. So when it sticks into a shield, it bends down towards the ground, and the body of the javelin fouls the shield of the enemy. preventing the enemy from using their shield adequately. New weapons maximize defense and minimize exhaustion in the Roman legion, and the old formations are improved upon. Troops become homogenized, and over time they get standardized equipment. They have consistent training and very harsh discipline. The term decimation, if you ever heard that, oh, the entire area was decimated, and they show not a building standing, like a tornado came through and quote-unquote decimated the area. They're using that incorrectly. Decimation literally means to destroy 1 in 10. Deci, meaning a tenth, would literally have a losing legion or a legion that retreated. The commander would line them up and count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Number 10 didn't matter if he was the worst fighter or the best fighter or somewhere in between. The previous 9 were forced to beat him to death, and he would continue on down the line. 11, 12, 13, 14, so on and so forth. They got to 20, and that person got beaten to death. So this harsh discipline was meant to instill the fact that you are responsible for the success of the entire legion. Now, the Greek hoplite had older weapons that were unwieldy after a while. Old formations remained the same as it was 3 or more centuries ago, and the troops were relatively individual. The equipment was similar, but the training varied, and of course the equipment could vary in consistency and in quality. Yes, they did have harsh discipline, such as the Spartans that we touched on before, but not always. Some Greek city-states didn't have as harsh a discipline. So here we are with the Roman weapons, the gladius. See, here's the nice, long, straight blade. Now note there's a ball on the end and there's a triangular point. There's more pounds per square inch on that little teeny tiny tip, which means you're able to penetrate armor much, much easier. And the ball on the back was in order to reduce fatigue. It puts the center of gravity right in the middle of your hand rather than somewhere on the blade. And the scutum, as I mentioned before, that you would see them. See that curved rectangular shield? Note how they overlap nicely, allowing you to protect you and your fellows much easier than the round shields of the Greeks. Well, the first real test of this new system comes when Rome is busy acquiring neighbors. It had offered the chance of joining the Republic to Taranto, T-A-R-A-N-T-O, Taranto, not Toronto, Ontario, Canada, but Taranto in Italy, had offered the chance of becoming a member of this growing republic, to which the city refused. The city was an ally of Imperial, one of the Hellenistic warlord states left in the wake of Alexander the Great's death. And so Imperial, led by Pyrrhus, invades the Roman territory, and as you can see by the arrows, really kind of wreaks havoc with the Roman countryside. Excuse me. The Hellenistic military traditions were very well entrenched in Imperial, and they used their forces to great effect, partly because Imperial was able to field a much, much larger army than the Romans could field themselves. At the end of it, Pyrrhus found he could not sack or attack Rome, and so the result was that although Imperial technically won, he lost so many men and it cost so much money that he might as well not have even gotten into the war. So hence we have this idea of a Pyrrhic victory. It's a win, but it's a very costly win. Now the Romans go about absorbing weak neighbors, particularly Etruscan cities and Greek cities. Those who do not join are often found on the list of cities to be conquered. After the 3rd century BCE, Rome expands relatively quickly. They're fairly successful. Thanks to the legion, whose disciplined troops are able to project military effectiveness up and down the Italian peninsula, but also thanks to roads, which make communication, trade, and travel much faster. Speaking of trade, a lot of these roads are reinforced and paved in order to make it easier to bring goods and services back to Rome, and to bring slaves as well from conquered territories. This improves the standard of living for many of the Roman citizens and the Roman Republic in general, experiences an increasing standard of living. In addition, extending citizenship even to conquered territories does confer benefits as well, because it helps more rapidly stabilize these new absorbed territories. Eventually, however, the Romans run into conflict with Carthage, and they're attempting to check the power of Carthage, particularly in the Italian peninsula. This leads to a series of wars that are watershed moments for Rome. This is the true test of the Roman Republic, and that's the Punic Wars. If you were an alien looking down at this map, and if you knew nothing of European history, and you looked at the Roman Empire and saw that, yes, it controls a nice sizable territory in the Italian peninsula, but then you looked at Carthage, the nice dark brown here, and saw how much territory it controlled, you would pretty much conclude that Carthage had an advantage in this fracas between the Romans and the Carthaginians. Well, you might be right, but there's one thing that the Romans have in store that the Carthaginians did not expect. Although the Romans really don't have a naval presence at the beginning of this war, allowing Carthage to essentially attack wherever it would like, particularly portions of Sicily and into the sea-borne areas of the Italian peninsula, and Rome was largely land-based and would have to trek all throughout Gaul and into Spain. The Romans were able to turn the tables on the Carthaginians. In the First Punic War, which was 264 to 241 BCE, there were new naval tactics that were implemented during this war to great success. Now, the Romans really didn't have very much in the way of a navy. Luckily, I guess for the Romans, a storm washed several ships of Carthaginian design up on Roman territory. The Romans then essentially reverse engineer these ships and learn how to build new top-of-the-line ships themselves. Still, they didn't have very many experienced sailors, so they couldn't outmaneuver the Carthaginians, who, in any event, had a much larger navy. So the Romans began to apply the very successful land-based fighting tactics to navies. When a naval ship slammed into a Roman ship, the Romans secured lines to make sure that the enemy ship couldn't retreat, and then marched across planks to attack the relatively unarmored sailors with a relatively heavily armed legion troops. The result was a devastating loss for the Carthaginians and a new control over Sicily for the Romans. In 218, a second Punic War broke out. This is the famous one led by Hannibal. Hannibal and his famous elephants across the Alps. Did you know, by the way, that when Hannibal came across the Alps, that he brought with him a rather sizable amount of vinegar? Well, why would you bring vinegar? Well, other than to make your greens taste at least somewhat more edible, vinegar was used to dissolve the calcium matrix in many of the boulders in the granite Alps. This made the boulders and the passageways much easier to demolish because the matrix softened the stone, and allowed the armies to pass unhindered. Although he did bring a lot of elephants with him, only a few elephants made it because the high Alps lacked the oxygen necessary for many of the elephants, so many of them died of altitude sickness. Nonetheless, Hannibal was able to wreak havoc on the Roman back country, particularly in the north, much to the surprise of the Romans. The Romans launched their own surprise attack, attacking Carthage directly, forcing Hannibal to return home, but it was too late. Again, the Carthaginians lose the Second Punic War. The Third Punic War was instigated by Rome. Technically, there was a violation. The Romans claimed that there was a violation of the peace treaty between Carthage and Rome. The reality was Rome was trying to regain its pride or assert its dominance over Carthage, and Carthage was captured and destroyed. There are many stories of Romans salting the earth around Carthage. That's probably not true because that was prime growing real estate. You didn't want to destroy anything that was going to grow lots of cereal crops for your expanding Roman Republic. Now, it's true that they were captured and many of the people were sold into slavery, and that the city itself was destroyed, only to be later rebuilt and named again Carthage. So here's the extent of the Roman Republic. Not too shabby if you ask me. Of course, by the time we get to the 1st century BCE, there are a lot of Roman or Romanesque people within this republic. Many of them are allies, and some of them are actual Romans. And one particular military leader, Gaius Marius, believed that he couldn't tell allies from Romans in battle. He had a hard time telling who was who and who he could command and who he couldn't. He instituted a second set of reforms, one of the great reforms for the Roman Republic, but also, I would argue, laying the seeds for the eventual dissolving of the Roman Republic. First, he makes all allies into Roman soldiers. There is no more, you're a Roman citizen and a soldier, and you're just an ally, you don't get the same benefits. In fact, many of the soldiers become citizens by serving in the Roman legion. He also allows the landless to join the army. Many times, in order to join the army, you had to bring your own equipment. Yes, it was standardized, but you had to meet those standards. At this point, the government, well, in this case, the general, pays for your equipment. He gives you standard equipment. He also pays your salary. You get a chunk of the spoils of any area that you're conquering. And there's the opportunity for social advancement. So a landless peasant could, at least in theory, become an important political power broker. That standardized gear, which was technically provided by the state, was really provided by the general, who, of course, enriched himself with these spoils and his political connections that he had accrued over time. And at the end of it, if you lasted the 16 years of service, you received a pension and a small plot of land, usually on the borderlands. Now, why would you want to put well-trained, loyal, disciplined troops who are retiring in the farms on the border? Well, of course, they acted as de facto National Guard, so that if there was ever an invasion, they could easily call upon some of these retired soldiers and help defend more effectively Roman territory. During the golden age of the Roman Republic, there grew an emphasis on education, particularly in the humanitas, or what do we call the humanities. It was expected that if you were going to be a good citizen, you should at least be bilingual. You should know how to read Greek literature and language at the very minimum. There really wasn't any Latin native literature yet. That won't happen until about the 2nd and 1st century BCE, but by the 3rd century BCE, we are having this emphasis on learning and on citizenship. You also learned rhetoric, the ability to speak and write well, kind of the equivalent to English composition. It was in order to solve legal matters, because if you think that Americans are litigious, you should have seen how litigious Romans were. Initially, Romans ignored Greek philosophy as being esoteric and not terribly useful. Eventually, of course, that does change. The aim of this education was to make people moral, intelligent, patriotic, pious, respectful, law-abiding as citizens. So it was all in an effort to ensure the success of the civilization. Education was the responsibility of every parent, and every child had an obligation to go to education and to do the best that they could in order to honor the sacrifice that their parents were making. It was also expected that these children would then defend civilization. The males, for instance, would join the military or perhaps serve the state in some other capacity. Gifted orators, particularly male children, were highly respected. Those who could argue well and eloquently were often destined for great things, or at least believed to be destined for great things. Now, women, on the other hand, female children, they their education was less rigorous. Some elite female children did receive very advanced education and became scholars in their own right, absolutely. But most females really kind of received a limited kind of education, most of which was in domestic skills such as weaving and raising children and making food and household decisions and accounting and things like that. Now, interestingly enough, slavery in the classic period wasn't the same kind of slavery that you see in the modern period, say in the United States used to have. Yes, there absolutely was horrible things that were done to slaves. Absolutely. There were slaves who worked in salt mines and worked in fields and were beaten and were killed without repercussion. Absolutely. But some slaves were very trusted adjuncts to the family, often used as educators. Slaves who were in that role as an educator could use physical punishment and discipline to deter failure in their children, even if the children were the children of their very owners. So it wasn't unusual for a child who didn't recite things correctly to be slapped across the face or to be hit with a switch by their educator, even though the educator is technically subservient to them. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and the Republican form of government doesn't last inviolate forever. Representatives are elected, absolutely, but the seats are non-paying. This means only the rich could afford to become senators, and as the rich became more politically savvy and as they became more politically powerful, they often skewed legislation to favor the wealthy, and they became less and less responsive to the needs of the poor. And there's also a decline of what we call civitas, what the Romans called civitas, or civic duty. For instance, if you become a wealthy merchant, you owe it to your society to pay it back for the opportunity you've been granted. So maybe you'll erect a fountain, or maybe you'll pay for a fire brigade, or maybe you'll erect a temple or at least a shrine, so that others can not only experience the greatness of the civilization, but then be reminded of the greatness that you became. Well, there was a decline of that. Fewer and fewer people felt responsible for the welfare of the larger populace of the republic. And senators, consuls, and governors began to become immune to Roman law, so that inviolate 12 tables suddenly became very amorphous. They were immune to prosecution, and they could do anything while in office as long as they stayed in office. And there were an increasing number of poor Roman citizens. Many of the Roman citizens found themselves deeply in debt. They would have their lands either taken away from them through rather sketchy legislation or through intimidation or criminal practice, or they would be indebted to very rich individuals and would be forced to sell their land. The result would be more and more poor people moving into the cities, particularly in Rome, that had widespread slums and homelessness. One of the really dramatic revolts during this decline period was the Third Servile War, or the Third Slave War, from which we have Spartacus, the most famous of the Roman slaves. He was a Thracian warrior who had been captured and turned into a gladiatorial slave. Around 70 BCE, he incited his fellow gladiators into a revolt. And initially, these 70 slaves, which were armed with everything from pitchforks to kitchen knives and cleavers, escaped. And however, their famous escape and word of their escape reached out to the surrounding territories, and the sensational murders that they had committed in order to remain free and safe allowed their fame to grow. And within months, their ranks swelled from anywhere to 70,000 to 100,000 escaped slaves. Although Spartacus intended to return home, especially because the Roman legions were distracted with rebellions elsewhere, the advisors and his close confidants of Spartacus persuaded him to stay, and that was his downfall. Eventually, when the revolts in Pompey and Sicily, Pompeii with double I, not Y, Pompeii and Sicily were ended, the result was that the legions came back and absolutely crushed this rabble, this undisciplined, untrained rabble. And the result was that Spartacus and his followers were crucified along the Appian Way. About 6,600 followers were put to death in one way or another, usually by crucifixion. And here's the thing about crucifixion in the Roman period. If you were crucified, they did not take your body down because you served as an example to others. And so for the case of Spartacus, his body, or his remains, stayed up there until they literally fell apart. So it was quite some time that he was up on that crucifix. So the Republic is in crisis. There's a sense of increased inequality in Roman life. The plebeians are once again becoming restless. They have an unresponsive government. Power brokers are forming alliances to maneuver against each other, and nobody really cares about the poor. In the wake of this political maelstrom emerges three people who recognize the need for alliance. And this is a trio of powerful men who use populist rhetoric to garner support and to undercut their rivals. The first triumvirate, led by a man that we will call Gaius Julius, or Julius, who would later be known as Julius Caesar. He was one of the three power brokers in the triumvirate. He, a man named Crassus, and another man named Pompey, Pompey this time, instead of Pompei. Pompey the Great was extremely wealthy. He'd be a multi-billionaire in today's dollars. And they worked together in this kind of power-sharing scheme. Julius was a general and a politician, and he was essentially the charismatic face of the triumvirate. He makes a lot of very grandiose promises, and as a result, a lot of the Republicans, or a lot of the clients, begin to vote for the policies and the hangers-on of the first triumvirate, if not directly for the triumvirate. They promised to restore land to veterans who had been dispossessed. They promised to restore land to plebeians who backed them. They promised all sorts of reforms and that they would clean house, essentially. Over time, however, the power that was accrued by Gaius Julius eclipsed the money and the power resident in Pompey and Crassus. Crassus dies. He was this kind of career politician who was able to make a lot of different agreements and kind of was the bridge between Pompey and Julius. Pompey is very rich and immediately turns upon Julius, jealous or actually envious of his popularity. And Pompey and Julius have this falling out after the death of Crassus around 53 BCE. Pompey uses money to undercut Julius, and Julius is using his popularity and military connections to try to undercut Pompey. Now, remember when I said that those Marianist reforms, or the Marius reforms, were laying the foundation of the eventual dissolution of the Republic? Well, here we are. The Marian reforms, army is usually paid by the general. Julius, in charge of a large, loyal, experienced legion who owe him for their pay, their retirement, and their continued success. His success in Gaul in 51 BCE, although spun as revenge for the Celtic raids of 3rd century BCE, was actually a land grab. The Romans acquire lucrative gold mines and silver mines, and the army gets this huge bonus. So he's setting himself up to be the de facto leader of at least this legion. He knows there's trouble on the horizon. Usually when a conqueror makes some dramatic gain of territory, there's usually a triumphal parade after the conquest. The legions march victoriously through Rome. There's banners and musicians, and there's this great pomp and circumstance as they march through Rome. And as they're marching through, there are slaves who are throwing money to the onlookers, and of course the conquering general sponsors games, entertainment, banquets for days after the conquest. And Julius does the same thing. So the struggle between Julius and Pompey puts Rome on the verge of civil war. Pompey, very wealthy, able to outspend Julius, but Julius, very popular, able to outmaneuver Pompey. There's political enmity. They hate each other. And indeed, there are political opportunities made by Julius. In fact, they may have been instigated by Julius. Was a lot of plebeian riots, especially in Rome. The corruption of the Senate is obvious and blatant. It is fairly common knowledge that senators can get away literally with murder. And at the height of this struggle between the two, Julius is ordered to return to Rome without his legions in order to stand trial for treason and abuses while in office. This would be a rare instance of trying a proconsul. He was the governor of Gaul. This would be a rare instance of trying a proconsul for wrongdoing while in office. Julius instead returns with his legion and is rumored to have said alia jacta est, Latin for the die is cast. In other words, he is taking a gamble that he's going to plunge Rome into a civil war and wind up on the losing end of this. The result was, though, that the Senate and Pompey were flee because the home legions, the legions in the Italian peninsula, were inadequate compared to the battle-hardened veterans from Gaul. And so they were inadequate to stop Julius's experienced legions. Many of them switch sides and join Julius because he's winning. He might as well be on the winning side. Julius, who would later crown himself Caesar as the dictator of Rome, would then pursue Pompey and his other rivals to the ends of the Mediterranean. He even gets as far as Egypt, where he eventually meets Cleopatra. So here's the new structure of Rome. We have a dictator who is absolutely in charge. He has emergency powers. This harkens back to the original agreement of the Republic, harkens back to the famous Cincinnatus, who, as an exiled former member of the Senate, was asked to come back and lead Rome in a time of crisis. And dictators were meant to be leaders, absolute leaders, in a time of crisis. Julius Caesar says that it is a time of crisis, it is a time of civil war, we need order, and so he makes himself dictator. Dictator is in charge of the Senate. The Senate is under the auspices of the dictator. Those who survive are pretty much either afraid of him or are supporters of him, and the Senate then uses the consuls to execute what is, in essence, the will of the dictator. Julius does institute a lot of really good reforms that he had promised before. He begins redistributing land, for example, by force of arms if necessary. So especially senators who had opposed him, such as Pompey and others who had opposed him, often their lands were confiscated. Some land went to him, some land went to his supporters, and then others, less choice pieces of land, were given to veterans of the army. He also ordered the restructuring of debts. He, again, enforced by his army if necessary. By and large, debts were reduced by about a quarter just through dictatorial fiat. He decreed that debts owed by plebeians were to be reduced by 25%, which is a pretty good deal. And he also institutes the reform of the calendar. The Romans had been using a 10-month lunar calendar, which then changed to a 12-month solar calendar. The extra day was added every 4 years. This is a Egyptian invention, something the Egyptians had been doing for quite some time. By the time it's adopted by the Romans, and this is the Julian calendar. And the Senate, in the way that only a rubber stamp body would, renames Quintilis, the 5th month, to July in his honor. His successor, Julius Caesar's successor, Octavian, who also becomes known as Augustus Caesar, will rename a month August in his own honor, of course. Then, of course, you have September, which is supposed to be the 7th month, and October, which is the 8th month, November, which is the 10th month, and December, Deca, is the 10th month. I don't know where June and May and all that comes in, but it's definitely not from Latin as far as I know. Caesar's policies were considered tyrannical or king-like by conservative elements within the Senate. First of all, he's giving away their land, the land that they had worked really hard to get. I mean, you know, it's really tough engineering the laws and the debt system so that you can acquire a lot of this land, for example. And so a plot was hatched to kill Caesar on the Senate floor, where he would be most vulnerable. He cannot take any loyal Roman troops, any bodyguards in with him. The idea was, of course, this is a neutral ground. It's supposed to be bereft of any kind of intimidation, and Caesar has no idea what's going to happen. An ally of Caesar, however, Marcus Antonius, also known as Mark Antony, tries to stop the assassination but was prevented from entering the Senate complex, and as a result, Caesar was stabbed to death on March 15th, hence the term the Ides of March. Beware the Ides of March. 44 BCE, Caesar is stabbed to death, especially by people that he thought initially were friends, such as Marcus Brutus, also known as Brute. Allegedly, his last words were kai su teknon, which is Greek for you too, child, because he had been a political patron of Marcus Brutus, had been relatively close to him, and Brutus was one of the ones stabbing him. It is changed to Shakespeare's Et tu, Brute. Both are considered historical fiction, but the kai su teknon is probably closer to what he might have said if he said anything at all. After you have several daggers in your body, I don't think you're going to be able to say too much, even as your last gasp. So why kill Caesar? Well, Brutus and the others assumed that they were protecting the Republic. They believed that the plebeians would support their actions because who doesn't love the Republic? The Republic is great. And that they would use this wave of popular support to strengthen the position of the Senate and bring the Republic out of an impending civil war. The reality was that, as Mark Antony threatened at the funeral of Julius Caesar, that the liberators would be attacked by the mobs because the mobs didn't care about theoretical, philosophical, or rhetorical arguments about the virtue of the Republic. They just knew that Julius Caesar, who had given them land and had reduced their debt and was looking to reform the government, had just been murdered by the very bunch that Julius Caesar said he was going to reform. Cassius and Brutus, two leaders of the Senate, tried to explain their role as liberators to mobs at Julius Caesar's funeral, and this appeal to Republican traditions fell on deaf ears, as there was widespread spontaneous mob violence. Sections of Rome were burned and looted and pillaged, and the result was the Republic was plunged into a civil war. Alright guys, it'll be up to you to see how we get into a Roman Empire. Make sure you read Mackay chapter 6. Don't forget those sources. They are important. Trust me, they are. I'll be posting some additional resources that help you understand what it was like to live in Rome at that time. And of course, email me if you have any questions. Remember, the midterm is not too far off. That's it for this week. I hope you all enjoyed the lecture, and I'll see you again next week.